Vicki has a degree in landscape architecture and works for NRCS in Illinois. She will be sharing about pollinator garden design. She recently worked with NRCS biologists to develop a pollinator garden design guide to help people make their own landscapes friendly to pollinators.
Thank you, Elise, for this opportunity to speak today. As Elise mentioned, I'm going to be speaking on gardening and pollinators and the value of planting for pollinators in our own spaces. As Eleanor laid out in her presentation, pollinators and insects play a critical role in our environment. And though one garden may seem insignificant, like a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall landscape and the overall habitat need, when you consider that in the United States, we mow an area roughly the size of the state of Indiana, you realize collectively, if we all did a little to support pollinators in our yards, we could have a significant impact. A number of years ago, Ellen Starr, who will be speaking next, and I had an opportunity to work with the Princeton Library to design and install a demonstration pollinator garden. This here is a picture of the garden in Princeton. And most of the work we do as agencies, NRCS and SWCD, is in the developing pollinator habitat on larger tracts of land through farm bill programs. However, in working on this garden, we saw an opportunity to put together information for people who were interested in doing something for pollinators on their property, but had much smaller areas to work with. So we decided to develop a pollinator garden design guide that would kind of lay out the process from the beginning to the end, from site preparation through maintenance, for people who might be interested in developing their own pollinator gardens, or people who might be working with a group such as a school. And this guide is available along with a lot of other information on insects and pollinators on the Illinois NRCS pollinator page. Elise is going to drop a link to this page in the chat on the right of the screen. And you can also find the page by searching Illinois NRCS pollinator from most browsers. Today, in the time I have, I wanted to touch on some of the information covered in the Pollinator Garden Design Guide, information including what do pollinators need in a garden, how do you prepare your site for planting, introduce you to the garden designs we've included in this guide, and provide information about maintaining your garden. I also wanted to share with you some photos of pollinator gardens and some native, some naturalized gardens for inspiration. So, what do pollinators need in a garden? They need a source of energy, nectar and pollen, and they need areas to rest and nest, and they need an environment that is not toxic to them. So not unlike the needs that we have as human beings. Food. In your gardens, you want to select plants that offer pollinators a supply of pollen and nectar, concentrating on plants that are native, and even better, native to the region that you live. Because those insects and pollinators and those native plants have evolved together. How do you know what those plants are? In the chat, Elise is going to share a couple of lists and a couple of sites you can visit. There are, of course, plants listed in our design guide, but these will be in addition to that. So the first list is particularly useful for native plants that do well in a landscape setting. And you can find it on the site Natural Garden Natives. So this is actually a wholesale grower site, and I'm not necessarily endorsing any nurseries, but they have a really nice list here that's worth checking out. Excuse me. And then we have a few lists you can find on the Illinois NRCS pollinator page as well. The same page as the design guide. When you go there, just look right below the design guide and you'll find those lists. I've also noticed that many nurseries, particularly native plant nurseries, now designate plants that are important to pollinators on their websites. And if you want to get deep in the woods, you can find out, deep in the weeds, I should say, more appropriately, you can find out what plants grow in your region by checking out the USDA plants database online or the website illinoiswildflowers.info. I think Elise is also going to pop those into the chat. Those sites will give you some idea of the range of a given plant by the county. You do have to look up plants individually, so it requires a little time, but there's a lot of good information there. Like us, pollinators eat all the time. They need a continuous supply of food throughout the growing season. So it's important to provide continuous bloom or flowers blooming during the entire flight season, from early spring to late fall. The gardens in the guide each include 9 different forb species or native flowering plants, in addition to grasses that cover that time span. And if you don't have room in your garden to plant all of the plants, consider teaming up with a neighbor or even multiple neighbors. I love the idea of a neighborhood pollinator garden, and gardening is a great way to connect with and meet other people. Another beneficial practice is clustering plants of the same species together for efficient foraging, especially for bees, who commonly display something called floral constancy. Bees are focused foragers. Unlike myself at a grocery store, they get what they go for. When they are out foraging, they tend to collect from one species at a time. They'll move, say, from one aster to another, which also makes them good pollinators because they get the right pollen to the right plant, the aster pollen to the aster plant. And nesting areas. Many of our native bees are ground nesting bees, and as Eleanor mentioned, and like to nest at the base of plants. It's a good idea to leave some bare areas of soil for ground nesters in your garden. Having said that, though, when you first plant your garden, you will likely want to mulch it. That helps control weeds and helps maintain the soil moisture and soil temperature. However, you might leave some areas of bare soil around the garden, and then once the plants are established, discontinue or limit the use of mulch. In my yard, I actually have a hill that faces south with areas of bare soil on it, and every spring the hill is filled literally with pencil-sized holes and humming with ground nesting bees. Last year, I was pulling weeds when I heard a bee fly right past my ear and saw it slip into a nest at the base of some Pennsylvania sedge. It was very cool to watch. Other bees nest in cavities, such as the hollow stems of plants or old borer holes. So it's also important to leave some plants standing in the fall for bees to nest in, and even some deadwood if you have that as well. I would also add that in the fall, the colonies of bees like the bumblebee die off, leaving only the new queen to overwinter. Usually she'll overwinter just below the surface of the soil. So waiting until later in the spring, like April, May, to rake out your beds can help to ensure that you don't disturb the queen, who is responsible for carrying on the survival of the entire colony. And then avoid or limit the use of insecticides. You don't want to invite pollinators to your garden and then inadvertently kill them with insecticides. So limit their use and read any labels before using any insecticide. One type of insecticide, since systemic insecticides, are of particular concern. Those are the insecticides that are taken up into plant tissue and can persist in pollen and nectar. In fact, when you buy your plants at the nursery, you may want to check the label or ask if they've been treated with systemic insecticides. Planting your garden is hands down the fun part of establishing a garden. But site preparation and maintenance can make or break your garden. I think you could compare site prep to getting ready to paint a room in an old house. It takes a lot of time to fill the nail holes, repair the cracks before you paint, and it is not glamorous, but once you see the finished product, you're happy you spent the time doing it. Garden site prep is similar, except your goal is to eliminate the competition, and that includes any existing vegetation that's currently growing there and any seeds or roots in the soil that could grow given the opportunity. The 4 methods we cover in the handout include sod removal, smothering, tilling, and herbicide application. And they all have their pros and cons. Sod removal is the quickest. If you decide today you want to plant a garden this weekend, hypothetically, because it's a little bit wet out, you could use this technique. It involves getting a hold of or renting a sod cutter, removing the sod, tilling and smoothing the soil over, and then planting. And this is the technique that we used at the pollinator garden. If you have more time and don't have access to a sod cutter, you could use the smothering technique. And if any of you have ever left a tent or a kiddie pool set up too long in the yard and killed the grass, you have the basic idea of how this technique works. Plants need sunlight to survive, and smothering them deprives them of sunlight. And you start this process by mowing the vegetation on the lowest setting of your mower. And this just makes it easier to put down any material for smothering. Then during the growing season, grab some old plywood or a thick layer of newspaper and lay it down over that mown grass. And in 2 or 3 months, come back and the smothering process will have done its work. Another option is tilling. And tilling works best if you have an existing garden or an area with little vegetation. In that situation, you may be able to just go out there and simply pull the existing vegetation or till the area to prepare it for planting. And then herbicide application. You can apply a non-selective, non-persistent herbicide such as Roundup to kill existing vegetation. And as with insecticides, always read and follow the manufacturer's label. In order for herbicide to work, the vegetation has to be actively growing. And if you have an area of lawn and it's not too tall, you could probably just spray the grass as it is while it's growing. That's sometimes in the heat of the summer it'll stop growing and it doesn't work as well then. However, if the vegetation is tall, you'll want to mow it to a height of about 3 to 6 inches. You want enough vegetation to get good coverage, but not so much that there's part of the plant that survives and you have to come back and kill it again. And then let me just touch on tilling one more time. So to till or not to till, tilling can be used in conjunction with other techniques. And when I say tilling, I mean like going out there with a rototiller or using a hoe or something like that. And the nice thing about tilling is that it makes it easy to plant your vegetation. It's nice and loose, just like in the gardening shows, you can put your shovel in and easily plant your plants. However, when you till, you can bring weed seed to the surface. And if your site was lawn, that may not be a problem, or if it was an existing garden. But if you have a site that had a lot of weed pressure, you may want to skip tilling and just plant into the dead vegetation. And if you do till and you're still concerned about competition from anything lying in wait in the soil, roots and seeds, you can always wait a few weeks, see what grows, kill off that vegetation, and then plant again. And you can kill it off with rototilling, pulling, spraying, any number of ways. So doing a planting design, especially with plants you're not familiar with, can be a little bit intimidating. So Ellen and I decided to put together 5 different plans for a range of different sites within the garden design guide. We have one for a dry site with well-drained soils, one for a site that may stay wet for a few days after it rains, a site with poorly drained soils. We have one for a mesic site, which would be moderately well-drained soils, kind of right in between dry and wet. And those are all intended for full sun, sites with full sun. We do have a design in there for a savanna garden for sites that might have a part shade. And then there's a tall border garden in there as well. And we try to include everything in there that you would need to have to plant your garden. So we have like, the gardens are 20 foot by 6 foot. They include the plant names, the Latin name, the number of plants that you would need, the height of the plant, the spacing that you'll want to space them on, and then the locations where they would go within the garden. And just as I mentioned, Latin names, many plants go by multiple common names, so it's always best to purchase your plants and double check the Latin name against the tag to make sure you get the right plant. And I would also add here that in addition to site prep and maintenance, knowing what kind of site you have is key to selecting the right plants for a successful garden. So you want to know how much solar exposure your site has. Is it a site with full sun, more than say 6 or 8 hours of sunlight, part sun with say 4 to 6 hours, or is it a shady site with less than 4 hours? And what kind of soil do you have? Well, you want to get your hands in the dirt and get a feel for your soil. Pay attention to whether it drains quickly after a rain, or whether if it holds water for a few days after it rains, or is maybe somewhere in between. I'm not going to get too deep into soil because of limited time, but we do have some descriptions in the guide which may help you decide what soil conditions you have on your site, at your home or school or wherever you're working. And you can also check out the USDA Web Soil Survey online, and they have an app available as well, which is really cool. You can actually take your phone to where to your property and pull up the app, and it'll tell you what kind of soil you have on that site. As an agency, NRCS soil scientists have mapped most of the soils in the country, and the information they put together is used by many people for many different purposes. But I should mention that the soil survey is accurate at field level, so like farm field level, not at the scale of a residence. However, it might be able to point you in the right direction on what type of drainage or soil texture you may have in your yard. It won't necessarily be that exact soil type. I do want to point that out. So maintenance. The success of many a garden rises and falls on maintenance. And I'm sure we've all experienced that, especially during establishment. And you'll often hear it said that native plants are suited to this climate and therefore are lower maintenance. And that can be true once they're established. However, during establishment, you want to water the plants throughout the growing season whenever the soil begins to dry out or if the plants start to wilt, particularly that first year, that year of establishment. And mulch. As I mentioned earlier, though we ultimately want to have some bare soil for nesting bees, mulch can be really helpful that first year to help maintain soil moisture, soil temperature, and help keep the weeds down. And as with any garden, be sure to keep an eye on the competition and weed as necessary. Oh, and I should also add a note on fertilizer. Fertilizer use is not recommended. The native plants don't need it, and fertilizer can also encourage weed growth. No sense helping them along. So our pollinator guide is focused on native forbs or native wildflowers, another name for native forbs, and grasses. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention trees and shrubs. They play an important role for pollinators. Trees and shrubs often flower early when there are fewer herbaceous flowers available to pollinators. I've noticed in my area that the buds on the silver maples are already swelling and some have popped a little bit actually. And over the next couple of months, many trees and shrubs will start flowering, including trees and shrubs like this serviceberry here and the eastern redbud. In addition, if you look at the canopy of a tree and flower, it packs a lot of flowers into a small space. Think of how many flowers are on a tree and then imagine how much room that would take to hold that same number of flowers on the ground. Honeybees actually collect resin from trees and they make something called propolis, which they then use to fill small gaps in their hives. And borer holes, abandoned borer holes or holes created by boring insects can be used by cavity nesting bees, in addition to the remaining vegetation from the last year. They can use these holes to nest in. And generally, a diversified habitat is more resilient than a habitat that is less diversified. So if you have trees and shrubs in your landscape, keep them if they work. And don't forget to consider them in any planting you may do as well. This is a picture of a white oak tree. This tree was actually approximately 350 years old. It got blown over in a storm and they had to cut it down, which was very sad, but that is just amazing to me. But oaks, according to an entomologist from the University of Delaware, Dr. Talmay, support more butterfly and moth species than any other native tree or plant. And here, this slide, it shows the number of butterfly and moth species that use woody plants for larval resources. And I like this slide because it really illustrates just the sheer number of butterflies and moths that are supported by trees and shrubs, you know, for the purposes of like egg laying, as larval hosts, and as overwintering sites. So that, in a nutshell, is a quick overview of the Pollinator Garden Design Guide from site preparation through maintenance. And this is a photo of a home in Normal where the homeowner used one of those garden designs as an inspiration for their garden. Here you can see at the front, there's the orange butterfly weed. And then right behind that is some side oats grama, a grass. Golden Alexanders, that's the yellowish colored plant. And you can barely see it, but on the side of the Golden Alexanders, there's some white prairie clover. And the tall plant on the right here is Blazing Star. This landowner also happens to be involved in the local chapter of the native plant enthusiast group called the Wild Ones. The Bloomington Normal chapter is in the process of developing a pollinator pathway map with general locations of pollinator gardens in the Bloomington Normal area. So you can find that information on the Bloomington Normal Wild Ones chapter website. I should also mention a couple of things about this slide. Anytime you plant vegetation close to a road, you'll want to maintain traffic sight lines. So it's particularly at the corners, because you want to be able to see cars, bicycles, things like that coming up and down the street. This planting here and the garden designs in the design guide were designed with potted plants or plugs, which are individual small plants, in mind. This site, however, this is a picture of a pollinator planting on a farm in Peoria County, and it was established by seeding as opposed to those potted plants or plugs in the previous example. It is beautiful. When you get out there, this is just a small slice of what you can see if you scan across the horizon, but the landowners used a diverse mix of grasses and forbs in their seed mix, and they have worked really hard to maintain the planting, including keeping an eye on and eliminating any undesirable plants that pop up and could become a problem. But one of the things that makes a prairie beautiful is the order and pattern that's created by the plants over a large area. The forms of the plants themselves, the flowers, the textures of the planting weave a kind of tapestry across the landscape. And the repetition of those forms, textures, and colors create a pattern, a sense of unity, a sense of order. But when you bring those same plants into a small space, you have to create that structure in a different way. So next, I wanted to show you some pollinator gardens you may want to check out for inspiration. And while we are looking at them, I wanted to point out some of the techniques they use to create a sense of order and structure in those smaller landscapes. This is a planting at Midwest Ground Covers. They have done two things here I want to point out. First, they've used plants that can hold their own in the landscape, plants that have good architectural forms, such as the taller rattlesnake master on the left, or plants that may have a long bloom time, like the coneflower in the middle there. These plants also will provide winter interest. And then they've used grasses in the foreground to create a matrix within which to place the rest of the plants. Kind of I want to say the bones of the garden, but kind of the bones of the garden. Native plants commonly used within the landscape industry tend to be those prairie plants that are smaller, though not all, and those that don't spread aggressively through rhizomes or reseeding, and those that have good form. The second thing they've done here is massed or created drifts of the same species. So anytime you plant vegetation in masses, it has a visual weight that plants planted individually do not. Massing, as I mentioned earlier, also has the added benefit of concentrating blooms of the same plant together, making foraging efficient, especially for bees who tend to concentrate on one species of flower at a time. This photo is also at Midwest Ground Covers, and it includes both native and non-native plants, but I thought it was a good example of massing, as well as the use of the repetition of color and texture to tie a planting together. Whenever you repeat colors or palettes of color, texture, and strong form, that visually ties the planting together and helps create unity. And you can see here they've got like variations of the color of yellows and sort of a light green colors, and there's purple spread throughout there as well. And you can also pick up textures that are repeated throughout the planting and across the planting and form. If you ever happen to find yourself in Madison at the University of Wisconsin, they have used a lot of native plantings on their campus. Here's the fine texture of the prairie dropseed against the coarser texture of the lead plant play against each other and allow the viewer to delineate one plant from another. I think anytime you find a planting, I think especially for people who don't know native plants, if they're looking at it, one way to help them tell that it's a planting that's intentional and not something that someone's just stopped mowing, say for instance, is when you have plants of just different textures, when you can tell one plant from another. When you get a planting that's all like medium texture, people have a hard time knowing whether or not that's was intended or not. And this is Lurie Garden in Chicago, definitely worth a visit if you happen to be in the area of Millennium Park during the summer. I also noticed a couple of years ago that the city had used a number of native plants near Navy Pier, if you happen to be down there. And near the Art Institute, on the lake side of the Art Institute, I think it's at the corner of Monroe or Columbus. I'm not Monroe or Columbus. I'm not exactly sure. They have a rain garden that uses native plants as well. Here they've used Joe Pieweed, a tall plant with a strong form that lends this particular planting structure. And then in the winter, it will add winter interest. And another nice thing about this garden is they actually have a website where you can go and look up the plants in Lurie Garden. So you can actually peruse through all the plants that they have there. I also want to point out in this picture, it doesn't stand out, but in the background there, you can kind of see a green wall, a hedge. And the hedge provides a backdrop for this planting. I don't know if the best way to say this, maybe like, or describe this, but maybe like a frame or a stage for the looser, less formal planting in the front of it. A wall or a fence, in addition to a hedge, could also serve the same role in your own landscape. And here again is Lurie Garden. They've used plants with flower colors that work well together. They've created a palette of whites, yellows, golds, silver that all kind of harmonize well. You have Rattlesnake Master again in the foreground. That's the one with the little ball type seed head there. A white coneflower cultivar behind the coneflower, or behind the Rattlesnake Master. It has the golden seed head. And then the tall compass plant with yellow flowers in the background. And this is Old Brick Botanical Garden in Madison, Wisconsin. They have just two other examples of nice color combinations. You've got on the left, the purple of wild petunia and the pink of pale purple coneflower. In the back, there's a light pink allium. And then I think the yellow, I believe, is a coreopsis. And on the right, you have a red of what I believe is a smartweed, and a pink of Queen of the Prairie, and then some purple of blue vervain in the background. And this is a picture of the Princeton Pollinator Garden. In this example, you have a small, tidy facer plant. This is wild geranium that was used to create or delineate the edge between the lawn and the rest of the planting section. You know, other plants like prairie dropseed, prairie smoke also work well as facer plants, the smaller of the native forbs. You can also use hard edges like pavers or brick, and that will help to define the edge. Or like the pavers in this example, create a sense of order in the garden. I should point out that a hard edge can also help prevent the lawn from creeping into your bed. When you get grass, if you get lawn grass into a bed that has other grasses in it, it can be difficult to tell the difference between one blade of grass and another to try to weed it. So it's always helpful to try to keep those lawn grasses from creeping in. And you can use a hard edge like those I just mentioned, brick. You can actually buy metal edging, or you can do a softer alternative like a trench edge, and that would work. Trench edge with a mulch edge. And a trench edge is really just if you were to take an edger such as a half moon shape edger and slice a straight edge along the grass and then an angled cut in toward the bed. So from the side, it would end up looking like a check mark in cross section. And again, that just helps keep the rhizomes from the lawn from encroaching on your bed. And then make it lush. A planting that is healthy and lush appears well tended. It also helps to prevent weeds from getting established in your garden. This planting is planting right in it's in the island of a parking lot. So very nice looking planting. And using sculpture to add structure and intention. Sculpture in your garden can help to create a sense of intention, add structure, as I mentioned, and even surprise. And this here is at the Chicago Botanical Garden. Here they've used really big sculpture and it adds a really big intention. Sign can also be a way of letting people know what you're up to in planting a pollinator garden. So that is kind of an overview of the pollinator design guide and some gardens that you might want to go and check out and visit, and some of the different techniques that people use to help incorporate those bigger native pollinator plants into their garden. I hope it gets you thinking about how you might incorporate pollinator plants into your garden, your own gardens. And I'll just close by sharing a few resources that might be of interest on this slide. A couple of books, 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants by Lorraine Johnson, Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rainier and Claudia West. And there are a few of the websites that I mentioned that Elise put into the chat on the right. I know there are quite a few people out there on this webinar today, and if any of you know of pollinator gardens or native plantings that you think are worth visiting and would like to share those, or have maybe a favorite combination of plants, we'd love to hear about them. Just drop them in the chat, and happy gardening.